everyone, and welcome to the final part of our lecture, which is part 5, and it is the classification of metamorphic rocks. And one of the most useful resources I've found is chapter 22 of Winter's textbook, Principles of Igneous and Metamorphic Petrology, which has been used to prepare this part of the lecture. So, to classify metamorphic rocks, you have to keep in mind from the get-go that the purpose of us naming rocks is to impart information about the rock, instead of just trying to put it into designated pigeonholes. So for example, let's start off with something really simple. If the rock is just slightly metamorphosed and it's retaining its original sedimentary textures, then all you have to do is add the prefix meta in front of it. So this particular photo that I've used for the cover of this slide is an example of slightly metamorphosed sedimentary rock here in my hometown of Terengganu, Malaysia. So you can see here it very much looks like sedimentary layers of sandstone and siltstone and some mudstone, but actually all of these rocks here have been metamorphosed. So you would put the prefix meta in front of it, so meta sandstone or meta siltstone, to denote that it has undergone a bit of metamorphism, but not fully metamorphosed, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's jump into our lecture. Okay, so let's get started on the classification of metamorphic rocks. So metamorphic rocks can be classified based on their texture and their composition. And as you'll find going through this part of the lecture, the naming of metamorphic rocks are actually surprisingly simple and flexible. It's so simple that you can even choose to add modifiers to attach to their names to stress something that's really important or something that's particularly unusual about the rock you're looking at. And also, please do take note that, when we try to give names to rocks, we oftentimes find ourselves trying to put it in the right pigeonhole. But actually, it is much, much better to consider a good name that is concise and imparts information about the rock. So as I was saying earlier, classifying metamorphic rocks are actually really easy. So we have these two types of metamorphic rocks that we can group the rocks into. First, foliated metamorphic rocks, and second, non-foliated metamorphic rocks. We also have high-strain metamorphic rocks, but we'll talk more about this later. Let's dive into our first type, which is the foliated metamorphic rocks. So before we look at a few examples of foliated metamorphic rocks, let's first discuss the common terminology used to describe these rocks. So first on our list, we have foliation and lineation. So if you feel like you've heard these before, it's because we discussed it really briefly in part 1 of our lecture. So just to jog our memories, foliation refers to any planar fabric elements. So think of planes. And lineation refers to any linear fabric elements. So think of lines, like our good friends, the straws in part 1. Okay, adding on to that, lineation has no genetic connotations, and some high-strain rocks may be foliated, but these are treated separately. Next on the list, we have cleavage. So traditionally, this is the property of a rock to split along a regular set of subparallel, closely spaced planes. So if you imagine the pages of a book or, stacks of paper, these are stacks of closely spaced planes. And if you split them apart, let's say you take this top sheet off, you will get a nice well-defined plane. So yeah, that's basically what cleavage is traditionally. And for metamorphic rocks, the more general concept is it's basically any type of foliation. So our good friend, the plains in foliation, where aligned platyphyllosilicates are too fine-grained to see, which results in this type of foliation. Next, we have schistosity. So schistosity refers to the preferred orientation of minerals produced by metamorphic processes. So this usually refers to mineral grains or grain aggregates. And these aligned minerals are usually coarse-grained. So it's coarse enough to see with the unaided eye. And the orientation is usually generally planar, but linear orientations are not excluded. So think about our friends here, the fine phyllosilicates, but coarser. So you get to see the minerals in the rocks. Next on the list, we have the gneissostructure. So this refers to either a poorly developed schistosity or segregation into layers by metamorphic processes. So gneiss rocks are usually generally coarse-grained as well. And we'll have a look at what this means in the next few slides. Now that we've discussed the terminology to describe foliated metamorphic rocks, let's look at some of the examples. Okay, so first on our list is a rock called slate. So slate is a compact, very fine-grained metamorphic rock with a well-developed cleavage. And what this means is that if you break slate, it will break along a very well-defined plane, like you see here. And you will find that freshly cleaved surfaces are usually quite dull, so it's not shiny. Next, we have phyllite. Phyllite, on the other hand, is characterized by a very nice satiny sheen. And this is because this is a rock that displays schistosity, where very fine phyllosilicates impart a silky sheen to the foliation surface. So you'll find that phyllites that have both foliation and lineation are very common. So next on our list of foliated metamorphic rocks is schist. And schist is a metamorphic rock which typically exhibits schistosity. And then you're probably thinking like, wait, why didn't we call phyllite schist if it displayed schistosity as well? So by this definition, schist is actually a pretty broad term. So technically, slates and phyllites are also types of schists, but in common usage, however, schists are restricted to metamorphic rocks in which the foliated minerals are coarse enough to see in a hand specimen. So if we compare this photo here to the phyllite earlier, you can easily make out the platy minerals which make schists, and therefore this gets to be called schist, while phyllite would be called phyllite. Last on our list of foliated metamorphic rocks is a rock called gneiss. So gneiss is a metamorphic rock displaying gneissostructure, and gneisses are typically layered. Some people also call it banded, where it has alternating felsic and darker mineral layers. So you have light layers alternating with darker layers. As you can see here on the rock, they're pretty well defined. So while gneisses may also be lineated, the segregation of felsic and dark minerals also needs to be shown quite clearly, and that's what makes gneiss nice. So gneiss was the end of our foliated metamorphic rocks. Wasn't that quite easy? And now we will move on to our non-foliated metamorphic rocks, which is actually simpler than foliated rocks if you thought foliated rocks were quite easy. And this discussion and classification applies only to rocks that are not produced by high-strain metamorphism. So if you remember, we had a third type. We'll discuss about that later. This is it. This is the one slide that will describe non-foliated metamorphic rocks. So to start off, we have granophyls, which is basically a comprehensive term that describes a rock with no preferred orientation. So the complete opposite of foliated rocks. Any non-foliated rocks with no preferred orientation, those are called granophyls. And if you want it to be a little bit more specific, then we have hornfels. So hornfels are a type of granophyl that typically shows very fine grains. They're very compact and usually occurs in contact aureoles. So hornfels are tough and they tend to splinter when broken. And that is it. Those are the two terms that we will use with non-foliated metamorphic rocks. And that is the end of it. Simple. So we've had a look at how to give names to foliated metamorphic rocks and non-foliated metamorphic rocks. However, some rock types are sufficiently common that they've been given special names, and as a rule of thumb, these names would take precedence over textural names. So pay attention to these names. There will be quite a few, but we'll go through them one by one together. Okay, in this first slide, we have 4 examples. We have marble, quartzite, green schist, greenstone, and amphibolite. So let's go through to our first example, marble. So marble, you might be familiar with it. Marble is a metamorphic rock that is composed predominantly of calcite or dolomite. And the protolith, the parent rock for marble, is typically limestone or doublestone. Simple enough. Okay, so we'll move on to quartzite. And as the name would suggest, quartzite is a metamorphic rock that is composed predominantly of quartz. And the protolith for quartzite would typically be sandstone. And some confusion may arise resulting from the use of this term in sedimentary petrology for pure quartz sandstone. But in this case, we're talking about metamorphic rocks, so quartzite in this case will be metamorphic. The next example on our list is green schist or greenstone. And again, as the name suggests, green schist and greenstone, they're low-grade metamorphic rocks that typically contain green minerals such as chlorite, actinolite, and epidote. And these green minerals are what imparts the color onto the rock. So these rocks are called green schist if foliated and greenstone if non-foliated. And the protolith for this could either be a mafic igneous rock or a greywacke. Last but not least on this slide is amphibolite. And this is a metamorphic rock dominated by hornblende and plagioclase. So amphibolites, they can be foliated or non-foliated. And the protolith is the same as green schist. It could either be a mafic igneous rock or a greywacke. So in the next slide, we'll have a look at how these rocks look like in a hand specimen. In the top left corner, we have an example of marble. Here we have a hand specimen that shows a coarse-grained marble, judging from the grain size based on the scale here. And this is an example of a marble quarry, where marble is being mined to make your marble kitchen tops, marble tiles, etc. And on our top right corner, we have an example of quartzite, which is metamorphosed quartz sandstone. On our bottom left corner, we have green schist. As you can probably tell from the color, it is green and it shows foliation, it shows a bit of schistosity, and therefore this would be called green schist. Last but not least, in the bottom right corner, we have amphibolite. So if you remember, amphibolite has hornblende and plagioclase as part of the main minerals that form the rock. The next 4 examples for our specific metamorphic rock types are serpentinite, blue schist, eclogite, and skarn. The first example, serpentinite, is an ultramafic rock metamorphosed at low grade. So the main component would be serpentine. The next rock on our list is blue schist, and blue schist is a blue amphibole-bearing metamorphosed mafic igneous rock, or mafic greywacke. So what this means is that it is a metamorphic rock that has blue amphibole, and the parent rock is either a mafic igneous rock or a mafic greywacke. And this term is so commonly applied that even if it did not have schistosity, if it was non-schistose, it would still be called blue schist. If you remember from the previous example, we had green schist and green stone to differentiate whether it was foliated or non-foliated. But this is not the case for blue schist, so even if it didn't show any schistosity, it would still be called blue schist. And blue schist gets its blue color from a mineral called glaucophane. If you remember our example from the Franciscan complex in San Francisco. So in some places, people would also call blue schist glaucophane schist, which is the same thing. It's still blue schist, but it's been called by its mineral name. So if you come across glaucophane schist in literature, it is referring to blue schist. The next rock on our list is eclogite. So eclogite is a green and red metamorphic rock that contains clinopyroxene and garnet. And the protolith for this is typically basaltic. And the best way to remember eclogite is to either remember watermelons, because they're green and red, or probably Christmas decorations. The next one on our list is skarn, which is a product you've seen in contact metamorphism, where you have aureoles forming around a hot igneous body. And this contains calc-silicate minerals such as epidote, tremolite, etc. And a synonym for this is tektite. And we'll have a look at what all these rocks look like in the next slide. Now that we've got all of these photographs of hand specimens laid out before us and the descriptions we've had in the previous slide, I'm pretty sure all of you can tell which rock is which just by looking at them. The first one in the top left-hand corner, we have the rock serpentinite, which has the mineral serpentine. In the top right-hand corner, we have our eclogite with its characteristic green and red minerals. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have our good friend, the blue schist, or glaucophane schist, if you'd like to call it by its mineral name. And in the bottom right-hand corner, which looks a bit messy, is our friend skarn. The last two examples on our list of specific metamorphic rock types are granulite and migmatite. So granulite is a high-grade rock of pelitic, mafic, or quartzo-feldspatic parentage, and it's predominantly composed of OH-free minerals. So for example, we have these garnets here, which are minerals that are OH-free. And muscovite is absent, and plagioclase and orthopyroxene are more common. So those are examples of granulite. The next one on our list is migmatite. So migmatite is a composite silicate rock that is heterogeneous on the 1 to 10 centimeter scale. And this rock commonly has a dark gneissic matrix and a lighter felsic portion. So you can probably see from this photo down here that it has a really well-defined dark and light portion. So migmatites may appear layered, or the leucosomes may occur as pods, or they can even form a network of cross-cutting veins. So that is what you would call a migmatite. So far in this lecture, we've had a look at how to name foliated rocks, we've had a look at how to name non-foliated rocks, and we've also looked at some specific metamorphic rock types. Next on the list, we're going to have a look at how to use additional modifying terms to emphasize features within a metamorphic rock, because as you can remember, the purpose of naming rocks is to impart useful information about it, and sometimes this can only be achieved by adding something to the name to make it more obvious. So one example of that would be to point out a feature that stands out. One example would be to name something porphyroblastic. So porphyroblastic means that a metamorphic rock has one or more metamorphic minerals that grew much larger than the others. So each individual crystal that we can see is called a porphyroblast. And some porphyroblasts, particularly in low-grade contact metamorphism, occur as ovoid spots. So if we look at this example here of a spotted phyllite, we can see spots protruding, showing that there are minerals that have grown much larger than the other ones. And if such spots occur in hornfels or phyllite, like our example here, then the term spotted hornfel or spotted phyllite would be appropriate. When you're describing metamorphic rocks, sometimes you would like to draw the attention of the reader to the different or unusual shapes you find in the rock. In this case, we have Algan gneiss, and these gneisses have large eye-shaped grains, which are commonly feldspar minerals that are derived from pre-existing large crystals by shear. And these individual crystals are called Auge, which is German for eye, and the plural for that is Augen. So Algan gneiss is a gneiss with Augen structure. Before we move on to other examples of modifying terms that we can use, it is important to note at this stage that as a general rule, you only use modifying terms to address things that are unusual about the metamorphic rock, because remember, we're describing rocks to impart information about them. So for example, if you're saying something like a calcareous marble or a mafic green schist, this would be redundant because you're already talking about something that is implied in the name, as is a fine-grained slate, where a slate is already fine-grained, and you're describing it as fine-grained again, so that would be redundant. So just keep in mind that if you're using modifying terms, it is to emphasize an aspect of the rock that is of interest, such as grain size difference or color or the chemical aspects. Next on our list are two prefixes that are commonly used to dissipate doubt about the parent rock. So in this example, we have ortho and para, which are prefixes to denote whether it is an igneous parent or a sedimentary parent. But again, these terms are only used when they serve to dissipate doubt. So for example, a lot of quartzo-feldspathic gneisses could easily be derived from either an impure arkose, which is sedimentary, or a granitoid rock, which is igneous. So if you have some mineralogical, chemical, or field-derived clue to permit the distinction, then you can use terms such as orthogneiss or paragneiss or orthoamphibolite, because that makes it useful. It helps to dissipate any doubt. And now we've come to the very last section of classifying metamorphic rocks, which is talking about high-strain rocks. In the photograph on the left, we have an example of a shatter cone found in Canada, and this is an example of a high-strain rock. So here we have this table, which shows a pretty simple scheme for classifying dynamically metamorphosed rocks, which are associated with fault zones, and we can expand this to include the more ductile shear zone. And for the moment, let's consider these terms to be purely descriptive so that we can immediately use Table 1 to identify any high-strain rocks based on the observed textural criteria in our hand specimens and in our thin sections. So to name a high-strain rock, first of all, one must determine whether the rock is cohesive or whether it falls apart. And then you would estimate the relative proportions of large class versus the fine matrix. So a rock without cohesion could either be a fault breccia or a fault gauge. And these cohesionless rocks are typically restricted to very shallow crustal levels. So cohesive rocks, on the other hand, are further distinguished by being foliated or non-foliated. So both of which are usually more fine-grained than the non-cohesive variety. So non-foliated cohesive rocks could either be microbreccias, which are less than 70% class, or cataclasites, which is more than 70% class. So foliated cohesive rocks are mylonites, and these mylonites are subdivided into three more types, as shown in the third column of this table, where you can have protomylonites, mylonites, and ultramylonites. And as we have done with any other classification previously, these categories are gradational. What this means is that it happens in that particular order. So virtually all high-strain processes would involve grain size reduction. And the degree of recrystallization in the matrix is not a factor unless it is very advanced, and when that happens, the prefix blasto is added, which means that the myelonitic texture is still apparent, but it's largely inherited from an earlier high-strain event. And in extreme cases of very high deformation, so thin and commonly anastomosing seams of glassy rock known as pseudotachelite are generated. So that there's glass which is attributed to the melting due to frictional heat. So that is table 1. So just to recap really quick, first of all, you would divide it up into whether it has cohesion or if it falls apart. Next, you would have a look at the percentage of fine matrix versus the large class. So in our rocks without cohesion, this would be the percentage of fine matrix. In our foliated rocks, we will be looking at in our non-foliated rocks, we will be looking at the class. And then in our foliated rocks, we have our myelinites, which are gradational. And if there's proof of significant recrystallization, we have the prefix blasto. And if you find glass in the matrix, then we would have pseudotachyllites. So that's just a quick recap of this first table. Okay, so table 1, we've had a look at how to name high-strain rocks based on the textures and the grain sizes that we could observe. Now let's have a look at how we could relate fault-related rock types with depth. So in more shallow areas, the fault zone is narrower. So we have a narrow fault zone. Narrow fault zone. And this involves a lot more brittle behavior. And this is where you would find, so you have brittle behavior, and therefore this is where you would find rocks that are less cohesive, such as your breccias and your gauges. Okay, so that is at the very top, so you have a very narrow fault zone, and you would find breccias and gauges because of this more brittle behavior. So below this zone, the confining pressure forces the walls of the fault together, and this deformation becomes more thorough and more pervasive, that the constituents become even finer. So this rock grades downward into cataclastites and microbreccias, and occasionally you would find pseudotachyllites. So deeper down still, you would find that these rocks take on a more foliated character, and recrystallization accompanies deformation. And this is where you would find myelinite. So going back up, we have your incohesive brittle fault rocks, and as the walls of the fault are pushed closer together, you get this more cohesive brittle fault rock, and you may find pseudotachyllites. And as you move even further down, you get this narrow ductile shear zone where you would find myelinites. And what happens when you go even deeper down into the crust? You would find that it becomes a more ductile, and it's more evenly distributed. This shear zone is more evenly distributed throughout the rock matrix, and at the greatest depth, the shear is distributed over a wide area, and it's not very intense at a specific place. So because the rocks are ductile, gneisses generally develop, and they're indistinguishable from gneisses from a more regional orogenic metamorphism. So that is what we would discover at this depth. So you would have striped gneisses, and that is the relationship between depth and the different rock types. And this has to do with the behavior of the rock. So at the very top, you have the dominant brittle fracturing, and further down, you will find it to be more dominant ductile deformation. So in the past two examples, we've had a look at table 1, which shows how you would name high-strain rocks based on the observed textures. In the figure that followed, we had a look at the relationship between depth and the different types of rocks. In this third figure, I'm just going to put this up here for your reference, that over time, scientists started to develop more complex classification methods to pinpoint better information about the rocks and how they were formed. So in this particular figure, it tries to relate the rate of strain versus the rate of recovery of a rock, and to map out where each type of rock belongs. If it looks complicated, it is a little complicated, so I'll leave this up here, and it will be of more use to you when you go a bit deeper down this path into metamorphism. So what I would suggest starting out at our level here would be to use the first table, table 1, to classify high strain rocks, while keeping in mind the different depths and the different environments that they would have formed at, like we discussed in the second figure. So this diagram here will be more use to you when you learn a bit more about metamorphism and metamorphic processes. So last on our list, we have a special kind of rock, which does not follow the classifications that we discussed earlier, and it is called impact rocks. So these are the product of catastrophic events. Such as the impact of meteors or asteroids, and these produce large shock waves, and these raise the temperature of impact to thousands of degrees. So this melts and even vaporizes minerals, and these rocks can be called impactites. So all impactites are breccias, and they have characteristic field settings where you would find an impact crater. So typically you would find an impact crater from the impact. So you have your impact crater, and also because it has ejecta, you would find an ejecta blanket if it's preserved. So this is typical of impact rocks in the field. So you would also find shocked crystals and also probably some amorphous glassy phases, and high pressure silica polymorphs such as coesite and stisovite may be present. So impact areas may also have these nested cone-like structures called shatter cones. So this is what we're looking at in this photograph. So you have this almost nested cone-like structure, and this is very typical of impact rocks. And that is it. And that concludes our discussion on the classification of metamorphic rocks. So just to go through it again really quickly, so we have our foliated and non-foliated rocks. So foliated, we had our slate, phyllite, schist, and gneiss. For our non-foliated rocks, we have our granophyls and hornfels. In addition to these two, we also had specific rock types for rocks that are common enough that they are named special names. Next, we had a look at modifying terms. So terms you can add on to further emphasize something that is unusual about the rock, whether it's texturally or chemically. So anything to emphasize something that is different and unusual about the rock, that's when we discuss modifying terms. And lastly, we talked about high strain metamorphic rocks and also impact rocks. And that is it. That is the end of this lecture and the whole lecture series. So I hope that this has helped you to gain a better understanding of the different types of metamorphic rocks. And as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at the address shown on the screen. And as always, I thank you all for your attention.